I have a good sense of imagination. Okay, as soon as I sit down, he'll give you the sign and you can get going.
All right. Well, what a great way to start. All right. If you were to follow someone on Facebook or Instagram, you could find out pretty quickly a little bit about them in their bio. For instance, if you looked at my Instagram, you could tell a quick, short few things on what I'm all about. You would know that I am from Tempe, Arizona. You would know that I love cycling. You would know that I do Young Life at ACU. It's pretty interesting to pay attention to the things that we say define us, or the things that we say we're about and say who we are. And so when we pay attention to those things, it's pretty funny because we say these things a lot. These things that we call labels, or the things that we describe ourselves as. Whether we're meeting someone new, or we're in a conversation, or at a dinner party, we define ourselves quite a bit, either by what we do, or where we're from, or what we're passionate about, or maybe a characteristic or quality, or a character trait. So I want to ask us, how would, if somebody was to ask you, how would you describe yourself in a sentence? It's pretty interesting to think about. So take a second, think about it. How would you describe yourself in one sentence? Would it be things you do, the things you're passionate about, or where you're from? I think it's always fun to pay attention to these things because what ends up happening is when we define ourselves by those, we end up labeling ourselves as those. And we claim that as our identity. So what I want to talk about tonight, what I'm excited about in the text here, is that it has for us is, it's not really concerned about who we are, but it's concerned about who God says we are. And I love that in Jesus' ministry, you can see his heart and his character. He loves to tell us who we are. And so we're going to follow along in John chapter 1, 35 through 51. The text tonight. So if you have your Bibles, you can go to John chapter 1, 35 through 51. We get to see what Jesus has to say of who we are, which is a wonderful gift that I think never gets old. So here we go. John chapter 1, 35. The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "What do you want?" He said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying and spent the day with him. It was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah," that is, the Christ. And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. The next day, Jesus decided to leave for Galilee. Finding Philip, he said to him, "Follow me." Philip, like Andrew and Peter, was from the town of Bethsaida. And Philip found Nathanael and told him, "We have found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." "Nazareth? Can anything good come from there?" Nathanael asked. "Come and see," said Philip. When Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said to him, "Here is a true Israelite, in whom there is nothing false." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree, before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? You shall see greater things than this." He then added, "I tell you the truth. You shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." In John 1, 35 through 51. So this is a wonderful text where I think we could go in many directions and take quite a bit out of it. But there's just two things I want to pay attention to tonight. The first being who Jesus is, and then who we are. Now, the book of John as a whole, when is about one distinct purpose. If you look at all the stories and the accounts and the conversations that John includes in his book, you can tell pretty quickly he's pretty concerned that we know that Jesus is the Son of God. That he's more than just a man, but that he is the Son of God. And so, in this conversation, just in chapter 1 here, we see John is just laying the foundation for his book. And in this conversation, we see that he is laying the foundation in these guys' lives, that Jesus is the Son of God. Which is an important point that we're going to come back to in a minute. And before this passage, we see John the Baptist doing his thing, doing his ministry at the Jordan, baptizing people. And he's actually the first one that notices Jesus. And he looks at him and says, "Look, the Lamb of God." He recognizes and declares it. And then the very next day, John is with some of his disciples and says again, the very next day, he says, "Look, the Son of God, Lamb of God," and then they start to follow him. One of John's disciples, Andrew, says the text says the first thing that he does is he goes and finds his brother Simon. And then Simon realizes that this is the Son of God, that Jesus. And then the next day after that, Jesus finds Philip. And then Philip goes and finds his friend Nathaniel, brings skeptical Nathaniel to Jesus. And Nathaniel soon finds that Jesus really is the Son of God as well. So we see throughout the whole book of John, and in this text as well, that John is laying the footwork and the groundwork, and his whole point that Jesus is the Son of God. So we see this chain reaction happen in the hearts and minds of these disciples and these men, right? And it first starts off with John the Baptist and ends with Nathaniel, and they're so excited, and they finally found the one, the Messiah. So they grab all their buddies closest to them, the people that are closest to them, and they bring him to Jesus. They say, "We found him." They gather each other up, and they go looking to find out more about Jesus. And in turn, they find themselves. They go looking to find more about Jesus, and in turn they find themselves. See, when John says that Jesus is the Son of God, he cares about that point because that means that Jesus is God. And if we believe that God is the creator of the universe, that he is our creator, who better to hear who we are than our creator? So we see Jesus is in the business of restoring us. We see this happen 2 times in the text. First with Simon, and then with Nathaniel. If we look at the text again, when Simon is brought to Jesus by his brother Andrew, Jesus looks at him and says, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which when translated is Peter. So Jesus looks at Peter and calls him Cephas, which in the Greek is translated to Petros, which we know in America as Peter. So Jesus calls Peter Rock, the rock. And as we know, Peter's not very rock-like, is he? Unless you count the time where he almost sunk like a rock. But Jesus is Peter is a pretty unstable character. We wouldn't have defined him. I think it would be pretty fair to not define him as a rock. But Jesus sees something in him that he doesn't see, nor does the audience see. And he says, "No, you are my rock, and I'll build my church on." What a great compliment that is. I don't think we would see Peter as that. I don't think Peter sees himself as that either. Do you think of a time when you've received a compliment like that, or a situation, or even in your head right now, as you can imagine and think back to a time when you've received a great compliment? Think of how it made you feel. You kind of get a little smile on your face. You get a little giddy inside. I think the cool thing about compliments is that sometimes they help us live up to something that we don't see in ourselves. If somebody came to you and said, "Man, you're a pretty happy person," you'd probably want to live into being a pretty happy person. You wouldn't want to let them down, or you'd want to live into that. And so we see Jesus look at Peter, who we would probably think is pretty unstable, and he says, "No, you are a rock." So we see Jesus first restore Peter, and then we see him do this with Nathaniel. So we're going to pick up again in verses 46 and 51. So Philip goes and finds Nathanael and tells him, "We have found the one Moses. We found the one Moses wrote about in the law, and about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. Nazareth, can anything good come from there?" I think this is worth pausing on and paying attention to. Notice how Philip kind of describes and delivers who Jesus is to Nathanael. It's pretty different than all the other ways the disciples previously shared who Jesus was with their friends. He doesn't say Lamb of God or Son of God as all the other disciples do. No, he kind of gives an academic delivery, doesn't he? He said, "We found the one that Moses wrote about in the law, about whom the prophets also wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God." He starts telling him as if he already knows that Nathan's going to have a pretty skeptical response. Gives a lot of background to who this guy Jesus is. And then, of course, we see skeptical Nathanael come out. What good can come from Nazareth? What good can come from Nazareth? So we then see, we then see that Nathan actually does follow Philip, don't we? So Nathan comes with Philip to Jesus, and Jesus, before ever meeting him, says these words, "Here is a true Israelite, in whom there is nothing false." Before ever meeting him, he declares this over his life. "You are a true Israelite, in whom there is nothing false." Man, talk about a compliment. If I ever get to heaven, which I really do, I hope that that's what God says about me. Here is a true believer, with whom there is nothing false. I think anyone would assume, and it'd be fair to assume, that Nathanael's a pretty skeptical character. We could see that in his questioning and in the way that Philip delivers this message of who Jesus is to him. It'd be fair to assume he's pretty skeptical. But Jesus takes that label, skepticism, and replaces it with what? Truth. And there's no false in him. I think in our life, we place labels on ourselves, whether we know it or not. Whether that's what we do or the things we're passionate about or the characteristics of ourselves. And unfortunately, the world puts labels on us as well in our society. We tend to cling to the ones that are probably more negative than positive. I think sometimes one criticism can speak louder than 1,000 affirmations. And so we push aside the truth of who we are, and we latch on to sometimes these false identities of ourselves. And these labels, they stick to us, and they cling on to us. So how do we get rid of them? Well, have you ever seen, you probably haven't, but have you ever seen a fox get rid of fleas? I'm going to guess you haven't. But the way a fox gets rid of fleas is quite interesting. When a fox has fleas, what he does is he rubs himself up against something really tough, like say a tree bark, and he'll rub his body up against it until he collects this little hairball. He'll take that hairball, he'll put it in his snout, and then he'll go and find some water nearby. And ever so slowly, he'll slowly, inch by inch, walk into the water. And the fleas have no choice but to crawl higher and higher up on the fox's body. And he'll keep going deeper and deeper until the only thing above the water that's left is his snout. And in his snout, again, is the hairball. The fleas will run to that hairball, and he'll wait for a moment until they all collect. And then he releases it. And the fox will walk back on dry land, completely restored. What I love about this story is true, but also that Jesus is in the business of restoring us. We see him do this in both Peter and Nathanael's life. However, the conversation continues, and there's a danger in this as well. We pick up right after the compliment that Jesus gives Nathanael. He says, "How do you know me?" Nathanael asks. Jesus answered, "I saw you while you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus said, "You believe because I told you I saw you under the fig tree? You shall see greater things than that." He then added, "I tell you the truth, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending on the Son of Man." He's like, "Dude, Nate, there's so much more in this than just me restoring you. There's so much more in just me telling you and blessing you with this gift of your identity." You see, I think the danger is that we fall more in love with the gift instead of the giver. We're more amazed at the miracle, as we see Nathan, more amazed at the miracle that Jesus knew him before they ever met. He takes his eyes off of the miraculous on Christ, not to the miracle. And again, the point in this is that following Christ is not about us feeling better, right? That's not what Christianity is. It's not about us feeling better. That's simply a byproduct. It's a byproduct of what happens when we fall more in love with God. That the only thing we are able to do is just fall at the feet of Jesus and praise and worship him. So just like Nathanael and Peter, Jesus can restore our lives as well. He could take those labels that we so easily cling on to and that cling on to us. We just have to believe that he can. So I want to end with this. If there's anything that you hear from me tonight, would it be this? That we can itch and scratch all day long at these things, but we are not the water. God is the only one who could restore us. He is the only one that can rid these labels and replace us and restore us to our true identity. But man, does he do so much more than restore us. He gives us an identity so much greater than we could ever imagine. I think that's what it means to have identity in Christ. I think when we find out how loved we are by God, we care a little bit less about who we are and start to believe whose we are. It's less about who we are, but whose we are. I think that is freedom and security and peace in Christ. So would we make space under our fig tree, or would we steep like the fox at the Lord's feet? And would we know how great our God is and how loved we are? That like the disciples, we can't help but bring our friends to him. Let me pray for us. Jesus, I thank you for this message tonight. Thank you for your word and your heart to restore us, God. If we are struggling to hear your voice, Lord, would you make it loud and clear? God. Would it be easy for us to come to you and to sit at your feet to hear how loved we are by you and how much we love you, God. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
Take a moment, make your notes on his sermon as quickly as you can, and then keep those papers because you'll need them when we share with Johnny our perspectives.